When you're learning a language, there's something truly powerful about hearing it in action, within a story. That's why learning natural British English through storytelling is one of the most effective, enjoyable, and immersive ways to improve your language skills. Instead of memorizing isolated vocabulary or repeating disconnected grammar drills, you're experiencing the language the way it's actually used by real people in real situations. Stories are like a bridge between where you are now and where you want to be as an English speaker. Think about how we learned our first language, not through lists or textbooks, but through the stories we heard as children, the conversations around us, the emotions behind the words. It's the same with English. When you learn through stories, you're not just learning what words mean. You're learning how they feel. You're hearing tone, rhythm, and flow. You're picking up idioms, natural sentence structure, even unspoken meanings. All of this is built into the context of the story, and that context makes it easier for your brain to absorb and remember. What's special about British English storytelling is the added cultural layer it gives you. Through dialogue, setting, and expression, you're not only hearing how British English sounds, you're seeing how it fits into everyday life, emotions, and decisions. In this story, for example, we meet Sophia. She's facing a major life choice, something many of us can relate to, and as she goes through this moment, you're following along in English, understanding her thoughts, hearing her conversations, and connecting emotionally to her journey. That connection is what makes it stick. Even small things, like how someone greets a friend or responds in a difficult situation. Harry's subtle language cues. When Sophia says something like, "I just don't know if it's the right time," you're hearing hesitation, emotion, maybe even a bit of cultural restraint. And because it's presented naturally, you'll understand not just the words, but the feeling behind them. That's what fluency really is. It's not only about knowing vocabulary, it's about knowing how and when to use it. Stories also allow you to review without it feeling like work. You might hear the same phrases or structures repeated in different ways throughout the story, reinforcing them naturally. You'll start to recognize patterns, how questions are asked, how emphasis is used, how politeness is expressed, or how opinions are softened in British English. And because you're hearing it within an emotional or dramatic context, those patterns are more likely to stay with you. Let's not forget pronunciation. British English has its own musicality, its own rhythm and melody. When you listen to a story, especially one read aloud by a native speaker, you're tuning your ear to those sounds. Over time, you'll notice your own speaking rhythm changing. Your mouth will remember how certain phrases feel when spoken aloud. You'll learn to pause naturally, stress the right words, and link sounds together in a more fluent way, all just by listening to engaging stories. And it's not just about listening either. If you're reading the subtitles at the same time, you're making a powerful connection between spoken and written English. You'll begin to notice how spoken language is often more relaxed, more idiomatic, more fluid than textbook English. This gives you an edge when you want to understand native speakers in real life, or even when you're watching films, having conversations, or writing more expressively in English. Now, the beauty of this approach is that it doesn't feel like studying. You're not forcing yourself to sit through a dry grammar explanation. You're not just memorizing lists of phrases. You're involved, you're part of the moment, you're watching a character grow, struggle, decide. And that emotional involvement gives you motivation to keep listening, to keep improving. It's active learning in the most natural way. So when we say learn natural British English through storytelling, we're not talking about a shortcut. We're talking about a deeper connection to the language. One where learning feels real. One where your progress isn't measured by how many rules you've memorized, but by how confidently you understand, react, and respond. Through stories like this, your English becomes more than just something you study. It becomes something you live. When you're learning English, especially at a B2 level or higher, you're no longer just trying to understand basic grammar or memorize individual words. You're aiming to sound more natural, to understand real conversations, and to use English confidently in everyday life. That's where real, life dialogue becomes so important. It's one of the most powerful tools to improve your listening, pronunciation, and vocabulary all at the same time. Real conversations are unpredictable. They're messy, emotional, sometimes fast, sometimes quiet, and full of little details that don't show up in textbooks. That's exactly why they're so useful. When you listen to real dialogue, especially within a story, you hear English as it's actually spoken, not how it's written in a formal rulebook. This gives you the chance to train your ear to understand how native speakers really talk. You get used to hearing connected speech, reductions, intonation, and rhythm. It's not just about understanding each word, but recognizing how words change when they are spoken together naturally. For example, in a story like this one, Sophia might say something like, "I've got to do what's right for me." That's a very real and common way to speak in British English. Now, in writing, it might look different. "I have got to do what is right for me." But no one actually talks like that in everyday situations. When you hear it spoken aloud and you read the subtitle at the same time, your brain learns to connect the informal sound with its formal meaning. And that's a huge breakthrough in language learning. Then there's pronunciation. You can read every pronunciation guide you want, but until you hear it spoken naturally, it's hard to apply it correctly. Listening to dialogue in a story gives you context. You're not just hearing how a word is pronounced. You're hearing how it's said when someone is nervous, or excited, or angry, or thoughtful. And when you hear those emotions behind the words, your pronunciation becomes more expressive too. You're not just copying sounds, you're developing an instinct for how English should feel when you speak it. You'll also notice how pronunciation can change meaning. For instance, the difference between "I can go" and "I can't go" might be very subtle when said quickly, but in a real-life dialogue you'll pick up on the stress, the tone, and even the pause that helps distinguish one from the other. Over time, this helps you become a much more careful and confident listener. You won't have to ask people to repeat themselves as often, because you'll be used to the natural pace and music of the language. And let's talk about vocabulary. One of the biggest mistakes English learners make is learning long lists of words without context. The problem is, when you learn a word on its own, you might know the definition, but you don't know how it's actually used. You don't know the tone or the common phrases it's found in, or whether it's formal or casual. In a story full of real dialogue, you're not just hearing the word, you're seeing it live and breathe in a sentence. You might hear Sophia say something like, "I'm not sure I'm ready to commit." That one sentence gives you a natural use of commit, and also teaches you how people express hesitation, how they reflect on decisions, and how certain phrases just go together. Without needing a textbook explanation, you're picking up collocations, tone, and subtle emotional layers, all while being emotionally engaged with what's happening. The best part is, you don't even realize how much you're learning as you listen. Because the story keeps you interested, you keep paying attention, and because the dialogue feels real, your brain treats it as real. That means your vocabulary starts to stick. You might not even notice it at first, but later on, you'll find yourself using the same phrases you heard in the story, without even trying. That's because language learned in context is remembered much more easily than language learned in isolation. You're also improving your speaking by repeating what you hear. After you've listened to a bit of dialogue, you can pause and try to say it yourself. You can mimic the tone, the speed, the rhythm. This kind of shadowing technique helps you develop muscle memory for how to speak English more naturally, and because you're copying real, life conversation, you're learning how people actually talk, not how grammar books say they talk. All of this happens when you use stories with real dialogue as your learning tool. You're not just practicing passively, you're training your ear, shaping your pronunciation, and growing your vocabulary in a way that's meaningful, memorable, and fun. And that's how language learning becomes a living, breathing experience. There's something deeply human about moments of decision, especially the big ones, the ones that catch us at a crossroads and ask us to choose even when we're unsure. That's why stories like this one connect so strongly with learners at the B2+ level. You're not just watching characters speak, you're stepping into their emotional world. You're understanding what they're going through, not just through words, but through the weight of the decision they're making. And in doing so, you're learning more than English. You're learning how to think and feel in English. In this particular story, we follow Sophia as she faces one of those defining life choices. It's the kind of situation many of us can relate to. Maybe it's about leaving a job, moving to a new city, starting over, or letting go of something that's familiar but no longer right. As you listen, you start to hear not only what she's saying, but what's going on underneath her words. The hesitations, the doubt, the fear, the hope. This emotional layer brings English alive. It's no longer just a language you're studying. It becomes a tool for expression, for connection, for decision making. At this level of learning, that kind of depth matters. You're ready for more than surface-level conversation. You want to understand nuance, tone, and meaning that isn't always directly stated. When Sophia says, "I've thought about this for weeks, and it still doesn't feel clear," you're not just translating her sentence, you're feeling her uncertainty, you're hearing the way she uses intonation to signal hesitation. You're sensing the emotional weight behind the words. This is what makes the language meaningful. It's wrapped in real human experience. And that experience helps you grow as a learner, because as you follow Sophia through her emotional journey, you're not only learning vocabulary like choice, regret, move forward, or doubt, you're learning how those words feel in context. You understand what they mean on a deeper level because you're witnessing how they play out in someone's life. This kind of learning stays with you far longer than anything you could memorize from a list. You also begin to notice how people express emotion in British English. It's often subtle, quiet understatement rather than dramatic outbursts. But it's there in the pauses, the softening phrases, the way someone says, "I suppose I could," instead of just saying yes or no. It teaches you not just the language, but the emotional rhythm of the culture, and by understanding how decisions are expressed, questioned, and finally made, you're building a toolkit for your own conversations in English, whether you're talking about everyday topics or real, personal decisions. The emotional journey of the character also keeps you fully engaged. You're not listening out of obligation. You want to know what happens next. Will she go? Will she stay? Will she take the risk or play it safe? That tension holds your attention, and that attention fuels your learning. It turns passive listening into active comprehension. You start to anticipate what might be said. You think about what you would say in the same situation. That inner dialogue you're having in your head, that's the sign of real learning. It means you're not just hearing the language, you're beginning to think in it, and maybe that's the most powerful part of all. Stories like this one don't just teach you new words, they help you grow as a communicator. They show you how to express doubt with grace, how to ask for advice with honesty, how to speak clearly even when you're unsure. That's the kind of English that goes beyond the classroom. It's the English you'll use in job interviews, in real relationships, in tough conversations. It's the kind of English that becomes part of who you are. So when we say that one decision can change everything, we're not only talking about the character's story, we're talking about you. Each time you listen to a story like this, each time you push a little deeper into the emotional experience, you're making a small decision too. A decision to learn, to connect, and to understand English in a way that's alive, emotional, and real. And those decisions, over time, change everything. When you're learning English, understanding different accents can feel like a whole new challenge. You might have studied grammar for years, built up your vocabulary, and even practiced speaking. But then you listen to a native speaker with a strong British accent, and suddenly everything feels unfamiliar. That's completely normal, and it's also why practicing with real British voices, supported by clear subtitles and storytelling, is so helpful. It gives your ears the experience they need to become comfortable with the natural rhythm and pronunciation patterns that come with British English. British accents can vary quite a lot. Someone from Cambridge might sound completely different from someone in Sheffield, and both of them will sound different from what you might hear in a textbook or a language app. But that's the beauty of this kind of story. You're not just learning textbook English. You're getting exposed to authentic pronunciation and real voice variation in a way that's easy to follow and enjoyable to listen to. When the story is narrated with a clear British accent and you're following along with subtitles, your brain is doing something powerful. It's matching sound to meaning in real time. You hear the way a native speaker naturally says, "Did you see it?" And maybe it sounds more like, "Did you see it?" Or "how I'm going to" becomes "I'm gonna." Those small shifts might seem confusing at first, but the more you listen with subtitles to guide you, the faster you adjust. Over time, you start to anticipate these reductions, these contractions, these subtle pauses that make British English flow the way it does. Subtitles help you bridge the gap between what you hear and what you expect to hear. Sometimes our ears aren't ready to catch every sound, especially when the speaker is using connected speech or regional pronunciation. But seeing the words on screen helps your mind fill in the blanks. You can link the written form to the spoken form, and that makes everything click. It's like giving your ears a little support while they build up their strength. This kind of exposure is especially important at the B2+ level. At this stage, you're ready to move beyond slow, artificial speech. You want the real thing, but in a way that doesn't leave you confused or frustrated. That's exactly why stories with voiceovers and subtitles are such an effective tool. They let you experience natural British speech while keeping you grounded in understanding. You can watch, listen, read, and reflect all at once. And what's great is that this process doesn't feel like a lesson. It feels like immersion. You're not just hearing isolated words and phrases. You're hearing full sentences spoken with real emotion and intention. You hear how a British speaker might soften a sentence, say something politely, express doubt, or show enthusiasm, not just through the words, but through their tone and pace. These are the things that make spoken English sound natural, and they are hard to learn unless you experience them in context. Let's say Sophia in the story is considering a big move. She might say something like, "I reckon it's time." Now, reckon is a very British word. If you're not familiar with it, you might miss its meaning. But hearing it in context with a clear voice and subtitles helps you understand instantly, not just what it means, but how it feels. You begin to hear these little cultural details that add richness to the way English is used across the UK. And that kind of learning sticks with you. Another benefit is pronunciation training. Listening to native voices helps tune your ear to the correct stress and intonation patterns of British English. Over time, this influences your own pronunciation. You might find yourself picking up the musical quality of the accent, the rising and falling tone, or the slightly clipped endings that give British English its unique character. It becomes easier to imitate, and eventually to speak with more confidence and clarity. The combination of hearing and reading also builds automatic recognition. You'll start to recognize phrases more quickly, respond to questions more naturally, and understand even when people speak quickly. It's not because the language has gotten easier, it's because your brain has gotten better at processing it. That's the real magic of repeated, focused listening with subtitles and voiceover. It sharpens your perception, speeds up your reaction time, and helps you think in English rather than translating in your head. It's a simple habit, but it brings big results. When you make time to listen to British English stories with subtitles, you're not only learning how the language sounds, you're training yourself to be comfortable with that sound. And comfort leads to confidence, which is what every English learner needs most. One of the most powerful things about storytelling is that it doesn't just show you someone else's experience, it invites you to look inward. When you follow a character like Sophia through a moment of uncertainty, when you see her wrestling with a life-changing decision, you can't help but ask yourself, what would I do in her place? That's when learning English becomes more than just improving language skills. It becomes a personal experience, an emotional and reflective journey. Sophia's situation is one that many of us might face at some point in life. She's torn between two paths. One offers security, familiarity, and comfort. The other promises growth, change, and maybe even something better, but it's also filled with risk. As you listen to her story unfold, you begin to hear not just the words she uses, but the inner struggle behind them. And the more closely you follow her decisions, the more you start to reflect on your own. That's when you realize the real beauty of learning English through stories like this. It's not just about learning how to say something in British English, it's about learning how to think, feel, and make choices using the language. You're processing emotions in English. You're exploring big ideas, fear, ambition, self, doubt, courage, all through the lens of language. That kind of reflection stays with you far longer than any vocabulary list ever could. There's a moment in the story where Sophia pauses. She says something like, "Maybe I've been too afraid to admit what I really want." It's such a simple line, but it carries so much weight. That one sentence might make you pause too. Have you ever felt that? Have you ever wanted something but felt too afraid to reach for it? These are the moments that connect us, not just to the language, but to the people and experiences it describes. You begin to realize that English isn't just a skill, it's a bridge to deeper self-understanding. This is especially important at an intermediate to advanced level, where your focus shifts from just getting the basics right to expressing your thoughts with nuance. When you're reflecting on a story like Sophia's, you're learning how to describe complex emotions, how to ask difficult questions, and how to talk about uncertainty, not only clearly but naturally. You might find yourself thinking, how would I say that in English? How would I express my fear or my doubt or my excitement? That curiosity fuels real progress. Even more interesting is how this kind of emotional reflection pushes your vocabulary further. You start reaching for words like hesitation, regret, relief, uncertainty, or commitment. You become more aware of how to soften your language when talking about sensitive topics, how to use phrases like "I'm not sure," or "I feel like," or "I suppose." These are the kinds of expressions people use every day when discussing personal decisions. and they help you sound more fluent, more relatable, more human. But beyond the language itself, the emotional depth of the story encourages something else: empathy. You don't just hear Sophia's story, you feel it, and in doing so, you become more open to your own experiences. You start thinking about the moments in your life where you had to choose between staying and going, between the easy way and the unknown. Maybe you faced a decision like hers before. Maybe you're facing one now. Either way, listening to her voice, hearing her fears, and seeing how she finds her way, it all becomes part of your own growth, not just as a language learner, but as a person. This reflective process also helps make the language stick. You're more likely to remember a phrase like "take a leap of faith" when you hear it in the middle of a decision that feels real. You're more likely to remember how to talk about starting over or letting go when you've just watched a character go through it. It's not just learning, it's remembering with emotion. That's the strength of English storytelling at this level. It reaches into your own thoughts and gently says, "What about you?" It encourages you to think more deeply, not only in your own language, but in English. It challenges you to find your voice, to put your feelings into words, to express what's often hard to explain. And that's where the real fluency begins, not just in saying the right thing, but in meaning it. One of the most rewarding ways to study English is when it doesn't feel like studying at all. That's what happens when you learn through modern, relatable stories. You're still improving your vocabulary, practicing your listening, and training your brain to think in English. But it feels natural, relaxed, even enjoyable. It's not a classroom. It's not a textbook. It's a human experience told in a way that you can connect to, and that's what makes it so effective. When the story is modern, you hear language that's current and relevant. You're not just learning phrases from a time long gone, or reading dialogues about ordering tea in the 1800. You're learning how people speak today in real life situations that you could actually find yourself in. Whether it's a conversation about career choices, relationships, personal growth, or moving to a new place, these are situations that many of us experience at some point. That makes them instantly more engaging and much easier to understand and remember. You begin to notice how people express their feelings in casual, everyday English. You start picking up on tone, slang, common phrases, and softeners that help make English sound natural. And because it's all wrapped inside a story, one with characters, emotions, and decisions, you don't have to force yourself to focus. Your mind stays engaged because you want to know what happens next. That motivation is powerful. It keeps you listening, reading, and thinking in English without even realizing how much you're learning along the way. It's also comforting to know that these stories reflect real emotions. They're not overly complicated or distant from real life. They're honest, thoughtful, and grounded in everyday experiences. So when you listen to a character like Sophia and you hear her doubts and hopes, you begin to relate to her. You think, "I've felt like that before," or "I know exactly what she means." That connection makes the language stick with you on a deeper level because it's no longer just about understanding the words. It's about feeling the moment. That emotional involvement is a huge advantage when learning a language. When something makes you feel something, whether it's curiosity, sympathy, excitement, or even a little sadness, your brain pays closer attention. It remembers not only what was said, but how it made you feel. This is where vocabulary becomes memory. It's no longer just study. It becomes part of your personal experience, and language tied to emotion is language that lasts. At the same time, you're learning how to think in English. You're not translating anymore. You're responding to what's happening, just like you would in your own language. You understand the situation. You hear the tone, you see the choices, and because it's all relatable, you start building your own English voice, your own way of thinking and reacting in English. That's something no grammar book can teach. And let's not forget how this helps build confidence. Because the stories are modern and realistic, they use phrases you can actually use. When Sophia says something like, "It just doesn't feel right anymore," that's a sentence you can take and use in your own conversations. It's simple, emotional, and authentic. Learning like this means you're not just memorizing abstract grammar, you're learning how to talk about real life, how to express uncertainty, make decisions, talk about the past, and look toward the future, all in English. The stories also give you the space to pause and reflect. You can stop after a scene and think about what just happened. What was said? How was it said? How would you respond? This kind of reflection turns a passive listening experience into an active one. You're no longer just hearing English, you're using it, shaping it, and making it your own. And because the language is drawn from modern life, it gives you the tools you need for real-world communication, whether you're traveling, working, studying, or just having everyday conversations. All of this happens in a setting that feels relaxed and natural. You're not under pressure to get everything perfect. You're allowed to enjoy the process, to follow a character's journey, to be part of a story that's relatable and true to life. And in that enjoyment, real learning happens, the kind that goes beyond memorization and reaches into fluency, the kind that makes English feel like something you live, not something you study. Thank you for being here and for taking the time to not just listen to a story, but to connect with the language, the characters, and maybe even with yourself along the way. Through stories like this, you're not just learning British English, you're living it. You're hearing real conversations, practicing pronunciation, discovering new words, and understanding how language expresses emotion and thought in everyday life. You're reflecting on decisions, recognizing different accents, and gaining the confidence to use English naturally. And more importantly, you're enjoying the process. That's what makes it work. So keep listening, keep thinking, and keep asking yourself those simple but powerful questions. What does this mean? How would I say that? What would I do in their place? Those questions are where growth begins. If this story moved you, taught you something, or even just made you curious, then it's already done something wonderful for your learning journey. We'll see you in the next one. Until then, keep learning, keep reflecting, and above all, keep enjoying the story. Goodbye for now.